So that's just back up. I'm awfully glad you're there. It's been an intense last 15 minutes. So starting now my official presentation. In December of 2021, the Italian W20 created the Women Entrepreneurs Act initiative known as We Act. It will have a multi-year focus on action and implementation of W20 policy recommendations this year in partnership with Indonesia's W20 presidency. The W20 and We Act, in collaboration with our longtime knowledge partner, the International Trade Center, launched a multi-year initiative last week to begin building knowledge and capacity to increase women's public procurement, an area in which women currently receive less than 1% of government spend globally. We Act will address other priority issues identified in previous W20 communiques and work with delegates on implementing them globally and nationally. We will create peer learning networks to do this, plus a global showcase of best practices and action alliances to accelerate progress in key areas impacting women's entrepreneurship. We also will develop knowledge partnerships and share informational resources, surveys, and webinars. We'll be sending out more information to all delegates as soon as the UN Convention on the Status of Women's March workshops have finished. Today, our W20 delegates will briefly profile some of the key issues impacting micro, small, and medium enterprises known as MSMEs, as well as several case studies of good practices in some of these areas. We'll start with Ann Simmons-Benton, co-head of the US delegation to the W20, a principal in Deepwater Point, and deputy chair of the board of the Society for International Development. She'll set the stage for a number of issues with an overview on mapping and building the ecosystem, creating the policy framework, evidence-based policymaking, the gender-clear best practice, and access to markets. She is covering multiple topics today, so we'll have 10 minutes. You have the floor, Anne.
Selamat malam to my Indonesian sisters, and happy International Women's Day to all. As Virginia mentioned, I will touch on those points today, starting with mapping the ecosystem. When we think about how businesses grow and thrive, we discuss an ecosystem or business enabling environment. For women entrepreneurs, there's really also a separate ecosystem for women's businesses. A good ecosystem enables women's businesses at the micro, small, medium, and larger to start, to grow, and to thrive. While working with USAID, I helped to design a tool that analyzed the business ecosystem for women and was known as Gender Clear. It's a tool that everyone can use to look at the current state of the ecosystem, analyze barriers, and identify concrete ways that it can be improved by our three earlier speakers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology, which everyone can use, and about cross-cutting findings across many countries to what is needed to build an enabling environment for women. So a little bit about the tool. Gender Clear is built on a methodology known as the Business, Climate, Legal, and Institutional Reform. And it was used to look at ecosystems across over 40 countries and used by USAID. It also has a 360-degree review of the institutions and the actors that contribute to it. After there is a baseline review and in-country diagnostic, Gender Clear produces a report to target reforms for improving the business enabling environment. The recommendations in that are used to help and prioritize the policy reform agendas for the government, for donors, for citizens and civil society alike. So let's look at these 4 pillars for a second. First of all, there's the legal framework, the laws. But how closely do existing laws in a country reflect international norms and best practices? Laws are not enough, as we know. So secondly, we look at implementing institutions. So how well do implementers, such as ministries, enforcers, such as courts, carry out their duties in efficiency, transparency, and predictability? And do sometimes institutional behaviors of these institutions inadvertently create barriers to participation to women in predictability? The third pillar is supporting institutions. And especially for women, we know that civil society is so important. This also includes business women's associations. And so how are those supporting institutions connected? And how can they help look at laws that govern commercial pursuits for women? And finally, and fourth, social dynamics, which Nani addressed so well today. How well does the legal system respond to users of evolving needs? And there are other dynamics, such as the bias that's involved, that these systems do not address. So we need to include them in our analysis. The key issues confronting women in the business environment and the workplace are looked at across 7 topics, which will be familiar to all of you and which our other speakers will address today as well. Women's role in society, women in the private sector, women in labor, property, credit, trade, and women in criminal justice, looking at violence at home and the workplace and what that does for women. So identifying the ecosystem for women can be done in a general business environment, looking at the whole environment, or a standalone, just looking at the ecosystem for women. You can also use the same kind of analysis to look at sectors, emerging high growth sectors, and see what are the barriers to entry and opportunities to growth. The way I did this and the way Indonesia and other countries can do it is gathering a combination of international and local experts, bankers, lawyers, judges, experts, and facilitators. Then we conducted interviews, and interviews from all aspects of the business environment, members of the private sector, government, NGOs, associations, and academia. And finally, and a key part to the methodology, is a presentation is made to all the stakeholders and the key informants to validate the findings before the team finishes the report. Also, and very important, in a workshop, there's a deep dive into solutions from the stakeholders there and identifying who should act on these reforms. So I have a couple of examples where it's been used for other countries, but I'm going to leave that to possibly questions and answers or another panel. So one of the things I'd like to mention is what, after looking at many countries, what were the cross-cutting findings? And there were 5 that are very important to any ecosystem. Number 1, women's business association and sector associations are critical. And why? For 2 particular reasons: to advance the skills of women to men, either due to educational gaps or sometimes lack of work experience or even perception. And secondly, advocacy for women in their sector. So the second particular area that's really important for women, and I'll go into more detail in a minute, is market access. International trade and government procurement provide special opportunities for women. Third cross-cutting is building business skills. This is important for women in all sectors, and actually even in government leadership, that they have the basic business skills to really start and grow and be a leader. And fourth, preferential financing needs to be targeted for women from startup through growth phases. And 5, tracking and analysis to demonstrate the business case for success. And this is something we know is really important in building an evidence base. So that leads me to my second topic of market access, as we mentioned above. In the diagnostics that we conducted, we discovered, and no surprise to anyone here on International Women's Day, that women-owned businesses deliver in both products and services, as well as male-owned businesses. However, women-owned business could not always compete as well on the domestic market due to social dynamics that buyers did not see women-owned businesses as competitive, or as Nani mentioned, there is that bias. But in international markets, purchasers are more gender neutral and want the best price and quality. So it's positive, but then again, the barriers for international competition are greater, understanding costs of delivery, standards, et cetera. So while they're an opportunity, there are barriers as well. So the question becomes, how do we help women across markets? Domestic markets are much easier to access, but not if there are hidden constraints. This is where looking at government procurement and the right enabling environment may be beneficial for women-owned business. Providing the policy framework and setting targets for gender-responsive government procurement is vital. Additionally, corporations, the private sector, can introduce women into their supply chain and procurement processes with beneficial or preferential criteria. Governments can help this by providing incentives, tax rebates, tax credits, rebates, et cetera, to companies that utilize women-owned businesses. And once women are included as primes or subcontractors to big businesses, this can be the enhancement that allows women-owned business to compete, win, and succeed in future procurements. And countries can provide help through the Ministry of Foreign Trade, Chambers of Commerce, and business centers to link women to international markets, decrease the barriers for access, and ensure inclusion in global supply chains. And finally, e-commerce can be a way for micro and small medium enterprises to access both domestic and international markets. And we have seen that opportunity expand during COVID, but to realize the potential, the government needs to enhance the ecosystem. Finally, I would like to address the research and evidence-based policymaking, which was a cross-cutting finding in all those reports as well. It is critical to create baselines and measure results to demonstrate to policymakers that investing in creating the ecosystem for women also benefits the greater economy. And we had a great presentation by Mikala earlier about the evidence base. Universities, women's business associations, civil society can also participate in measuring the case for women's entrepreneurship and the benefit to the economy. As mentioned in my description for Gender Clear, it's not only the laws, but it is also the policies and regulations that are important to ensure that there's a good ecosystem. By tracking what measures work, we can create better policymaking and level the playing field for women. Building the evidence base is critical to building a better ecosystem for women. This also underscores the important role that the W20 plays in country and global policymaking. Terima kasih banyak. Over.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was absolutely terrific. Barbara Cleary was Director of Equalities and Human Resources for a London borough. Subsequently, she established Head Start, which provides a range of services with a focus on change management, management development, and leadership. She is co-head of the W20's UK delegation. Today, she will be talking about the right to own property. Barbara, you have no idea how thrilled I am you're still there.
I don't know where that came from, but yes, I'm very much here. And
so,
hello to
thank you
everyone.
so much, and over to you, Barbara.
Okay, thank you. Hello to everyone. It's great to be here, and I've really enjoyed all the wonderful presentations I've been listening to. We've heard a lot about the contribution that women can make to growing the economy. And I want to share some thoughts with you on access to finance and the need for legislation around inheritance and owning assets. We know that access to inheritance rights, ownership of assets, including land, and the means of accessing finance, women cannot participate in the economy, let alone start their own business. And the Sustainable Development Goals actually underscore the importance of rights to land and tenure security in achieving sustainable development. UN Women, to quote a statistic from them, even in countries where women constitute the majority of small farmers and do more than 75% of the agricultural work, they are routinely denied the right to own the land they cultivate and depend on to raise their families. Legislation is required for equal rights for women to finance and investments, ownership of land and assets, inheritance rights, pensions and insurance, mobile and cryptocurrency bank accounts, and devices to enable them to access these assets in order to achieve financial independence, self-sufficiency, and contribute to growing the economy. E-commerce assets such as domain names, patents, trademarks, and intellectual property should also be included in this list of collateral to allow entrepreneurships for MSMEs to flourish. The OECD have reported that women's rights must encompass rights to meaningfully participate in discussions and decision-making on land laws, policies and programs throughout the cycle of assessment and analysis, planning and design, budgeting and finance, implementation and monitoring and evaluation. However, only 52 countries at the moment guarantee these rights, both in law and practice, because of discriminatory customary laws. In W20 in Saudi Arabia, we referenced women's access to finance, which is mediated by banks and lenders who do not always understand the barriers women face, such as limited access to collateral, and thus fail to meet their needs. Accessing the capital necessary to start or grow a business often means taking a loan from a formal institution, from a family or friend, or investors. However, the realities women face during their domestic role and discriminatory social attitudes towards their capabilities often interfere with their ability to access the necessary finance for their entrepreneurial ambitions. For example, in South Africa, evidence reveals that banks often fail to take a gender-sensitive approach and can deny credits based on a higher risk perception given by women's multiple roles in society, which is unfounded, but nevertheless, it's still very much a reality. So as collateral, we know is required to allow MSMEs, women-owned businesses, all businesses to set up. We need laws, policies, and programs that ensure equality between men and women, as well as boys and girls, in all matters related to inheritance. We need to ensure that the surviving spouses have inheritance rights and discourage the practice of inheritance renunciation. We need to address inequalities between men and women in other spheres of marriage, such as in administration of marital property, so that such inequalities do not undermine women's autonomous decision-making over inheritance. We need to ensure the collection and analysis of sex disaggregated data and gender statistics to ensure inclusivity. We all keep saying that we can't say enough. Evidence, data is so important. Ensure that agricultural censuses focus attention on women's smallholders and farmers. Ensure provisions for inheritance and ownership of rights apply equally to displaced and indigenous women, including financial and digital training, to allow them to build and their financially secure futures. And to provide awareness campaigns, education, informing the public on gender equality and the women's rights to assets, land, and natural resources. We've got to change people's mindsets. And finally, ensure all women's equal participation in public and private life, in financial, economic, legal and government decision-making in senior roles. That's where we make the policy, and we need women at those tables.